welcome to the Behavior Education Connection, the podcast that works to connect the world of behavior analysis and the world of education. We focus on topics important to behavior analysts who work in the public schools and those who support them. Join us and spend time gaining insights and ideas as our host talks with fellow behavior analysts as well as other experts in the field. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our newest episode of the Behavior Education Connection. I'm your host, Dr. Selena Layden. I am here joined today by Daniel Irwin. Hi, Daniel.
Hey, Selena.
Daniel's from the Virginia Department of Education. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Daniel. I know you've been with us before, but...
I'm Daniel Irwin. I am the specialist for autism and assistive technology at the Virginia Department of Education. I'm a behavior analyst. I've worked in both private day settings as well as public schools, and really, excited to be here, Selena.
So today we're going to cover something that I think is pretty important. There was a guidance document that was released from the Virginia Department of Education, and this guidance document covers the provision of behavior analytics services in Virginia within schools. And so there's a lot of different parts to this document, but one of the things that's in there is kind of avenues or pathways that might be requested for services. You know, if a parent requests ABA services or if the school wants to propose ABA services. So today we're going to talk about some practical planning around those. So one of the first things, Daniel, that I want to ask you about is how are we defining what a private provider is for our purposes today?
So for today's purposes, we're going to look at a couple, like you said, a couple of different avenues for how these services might be provided. But we're looking specifically at providers who are not employed directly by the school division. So we're talking about they're either paid through insurance, they're paid through Medicaid, or they're paid privately through parents. But it's not. I'm not going to say that. That's it. I was getting ready to mention the IEP, but we'll get into that.
Do you want to do that again, Daniel?
Sure.
Okay. So, Daniel, for our purposes today, how are we defining what a private provider is?
So today we're really specifically looking at providers who are not employed directly by the school division. And as you mentioned, we're going to talk about different avenues that these providers might work within a school, but they're not employed by the school board of that division.
Okay. And I think it's an important distinction because there are behavior analysts who are directly employed by a school division. There's sometimes that behavior analysts are contracted by a school division, and there's sometimes that they are paid for through private means outside of the school division.
Correct. And so today we're talking about those last two, either
Right.
Contracted by the school division or they're specifically for a particular student or a group of students.
Right. So what happens or what should a school division do when a request is made for a private provider to come into the school system?
So there's a couple of different ways they may choose to proceed. And one would be, and depending on why they're asking, right? And so if we're thinking about a parent who's saying, I'd like my child to receive some ABA services. They get ABA services at home, and we'd like to provide some of those services during the school day. And there can be benefits to that with the generalization of skills and sort of this continuity of interventions. But what the school needs to consider first is this a service that's required for free, appropriate public education? And so the school could call an IEP meeting to determine whether the service is required. If it is determined, if the IEP team says, yeah, this is something they need to get that free, appropriate public education, then it's the school division's responsibility to provide that service at no cost to the parent.
Within the school setting.
Within the school set, yes, thank you. Within the school setting,
right? Because children may still receive outside services.
Correct.
But the school could also be providing services within the school setting.
Correct, as part of the student's IEP. And so if that happens, then it's up to the school division to who is going to provide that service. So the parent may have requested that a specific BCBA work with their student in the school because that's who they work with at home, or for whatever reason. But once it's part of the IEP, it becomes the school division's discretion as to the professional that they're going to use.
Because they might have somebody already employed who can provide those services.
Correct. They may have someone employed, or they may be already contract with another service provider who does that for the division.
Right.
So if they don't, and it's, again, it's up to the school division, they may still contract with that same provider. So there's different options and different routes the school may take. So they might actually contract with the child's private provider because, well, any number of reasons. But they've got options as to how they're going to provide that service.
Daniel, if I could just recap that. So basically, if a parent says, I really want my child to get ABA services in the school, if the student is a child who has been identified as having a disability and receives special education services, it's probably a good idea to call an IEP meeting to discuss that request.
Correct. To determine if it is a service that's required for a free appropriate public education.
Okay.
And then if it is decided that yes, this is a service required, then the IEP team's got to document it, talk about the number of hours. And again, it's up to the school division as to who they're going to choose to provide the service.
So that's similar to like if a parent were to say, I think my kid needs speech services, or I think my child requires occupational therapy, or any of these kind of related services.
Correct. The IEP team would evaluate the data, look at the student's current IEP, assess the need, and then make a determination as to whether that service is required. So they may say, the IEP team may come back and say, where the student does not require this service to receive, we have developed a program, an IEP, that provides a free and appropriate public education to the student. And so they would deny providing that service. And when that happens, the IEP is all about documenting, right? So it would be documented in the prior written notice that the parent proposed the student receive ABA services in the school as part of the IEP, and the IEP team would then have to document that they denied it and the reasons why.
So if they deny that request, like if the IEP team says, we believe that we're providing FAPE, and so we're not going to add this to the IEP, what options are there available then? The parent still says, but I'm getting this service at home. I still really wish during the day they could get some of these services.
Right. So that certainly is permissible. It is not required that the school allow a private provider to come in and provide services, but they may develop a memorandum of agreement or memorandum of understanding or some contract with a private provider to permit that provider to come in and provide those services during the school day outside of the IEP. Now, there are a lot of things to consider if the school decides to go this route. So the student in their IEP has a certain number of minutes of services that they're receiving during the course of a day anyway. So part of that's the specially designed instruction and where they're receiving that, what subjects they're receiving that in, or what academic and behavioral and functional areas they're getting specially designed instruction in. There's related service hours that are required through the IEP. And so the IEP team and the building administrator need to consider if someone is coming in to provide services from an outside provider, whether it's insurance paid or privately paid, outside of the IEP, does the IEP need to be adjusted to reflect that? Because there's only so many hours in a day that a student is available to receive instruction. The other thing to consider is even if they're not missing out on those times where they're receiving either related services or specially designed instruction, special education services, there are still activities within the school day that are beneficial to students. So thinking about things like recess and lunch and transitions between classes and time in general education, all are important parts of the school day as a whole. And so building in another time where that student is not going to be participating in those things is a big consideration in thinking about the program as a whole for that student.
Right. And I think, there's the IEP component of it, but then there's kind of this other discussion of there's pros and cons to every decision we make for students, right? If a student participates in PE, there's pros and cons to that. If their student eats lunch in their classroom versus in the lunchroom, there's pros and cons to that. So this is another one of those. I think it's important for the school and the parents to talk about the pros and cons to make the best decision for that student.
Correct. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about people coming into a school building, the building administrator, based on division level policy, is the person who makes the decision about who is allowed to come in and who's not allowed to come in. Their job is to have an environment that is not free from disruption, but fosters efficient learning for all students. And so things they have to consider are staffing, space. If a outside provider is coming in, do they need to be supervised by a school staff, and who's that going to be? We've already got a teacher shortage. We've already got all these different competing factors. So if someone's got to go and supervise this outside person, that pulls away from the efficient operation of their school building. And so they've got to consider that, as well as kind of what the student specific stuff, but also the general operations of their building.
Well, and at the end of the day, they have to keep all students safe.
Exactly.
And make sure that they are receiving instruction. And so there's the individual student considerations, but then there's these bigger considerations of, if the student isn't part of the classroom, where are they, and who's liable for that, and all of those kinds of things. So let's say that the school division and the parent agree that a provider can come in for a portion of the day to provide services. What are some things that school divisions need to think about before this happens?
Well, one, as you mentioned, is the logistical piece of it. Do they have the capacity to support it? And if they've decided, yep, we're good, we're going to do this, I think the first thing you've got to consider is what's the purpose behind this. So we spoke before, or maybe it's going to show up in a podcast after this, I don't know, about sort of setting those goals, right? Having common goals that you're working towards with the student. And so identifying those and really making sure that if outside providers are coming in, that they share the same goal as the school team. The other thing they have to consider, and I think we've already crossed this bridge, that are the needs of the student being met through the current IEP. And so if they've determined that free and appropriate public education is being provided, then off you go. They are, and this is something that's supplemental to that. Right. How frequently? So all this would go into an MOA or MOU or contract or whatever. What is this person working on? Are there specific goals that they're going to address for the student? How frequently? How long are they going to be with the student and provide those services in the school setting? And then, as I mentioned before, how is this going to impact the students' school day and their instruction and the instruction and services they receive? Either way, it's important so if the IEP team meets, they determine that the service is not required for a free and appropriate public education, but they will allow a provider to come in. Again, there's benefits to that, right? I mean, it's about that continuity, and it can really help foster that collaboration between home and school. There's lots of benefits there, but document. I mean, putting all of the information in the prior written notice about the school team's decision and why that decision was made.
So, Daniel, there's potentially a lot of different private providers that could come into a school system. But with behavior analysis and behavior analysts, what are some pieces of advice that you might give school division personnel about collaborating with these private providers?
Well, I think the first thing is, and it is sort of our responsibility as behavior analysts to really explain what we do and why. And so if as a school division person, it's important to know that. And so either asking or, finding a resource that will help you as a school division person understand kind of what a behavior analyst does, can make a huge difference in really identifying how this person can benefit your program, benefit the student, how they might operate, just to understand the field and the practice that's happening. I think the other thing too is going back to that agreement, really being specific about what this person's role are, and also helping them understand the process of school, right? So
Right.
we know that through our network, a lot of people are coming into the field of behavior analysis, which is great. A lot of those people are getting clinical types of supervision. We're growing some, but we're not getting a lot of people right now who are in a school division and developing as a behavior analyst with kind of that teacher background. And so really being aware that they may not have an outside provider may not have kind of that understanding of what school is, how school works, but just because it's not in their background, they've got an idea from when they were in school, but not necessarily kind of the day-to-day operations and the mission and the regulations. And so being specific about procedures, and thinking about how you're communicating to the person coming in about how they sign in, where they are going to set up, where they can and can't go within the building, and just really kind of outlining and making sure that they know kind of what those procedures are. In addition to that, who their point of contact is, right? And so if they're coming into a classroom and supporting a student in a classroom, or they're pulling a kid out of a classroom to provide services, the teacher may be a point of contact, but it really, at the end of the day, is probably the building administrator. And that's going to depend on the school and the preferences of the people involved. But being clear about who they need to report to when they're signing in, when they're signing out, if there's issues, who they need to go to and what that communication looks like, and just being very specific about kind of those procedures. We're behavior analysts. We like objective things, right? So school divisions need to be objective in talking about and specific about just a lot of those really kind of boring, but important details.
So I'm going to flip the question. And if I'm a private provider, what's some advice that you could give me to make this more successful, and to build a good foundation so that the student gets what they need, the division feels good about it, and I can get my work done?
Yeah, I think in starting out, follow the school division rules. Abide at the very least, abide by the contract you sign. So that's easy. The other part of that is, really going in with the mindset of being part of a team, going into, you're walking into an environment that has a culture. They've got hierarchies and friendships and relationships that are likely very well established over years. And so being clear about what you do, why you do it, being friendly, being personable, trying to develop those relationships and communication lines in a really positive manner. But understanding your role. And I think that's a big part of this is, if you are there to provide services for one kid, you're there to provide services for one kid. And I think where relationships and the partnership could fall apart is if there becomes sort of this evaluative component to it, right? So as behavior analysts, we go in, we look at the environment, we look at the behaviors, we look at all the things that are influencing what the student's doing. And a big part of that is classroom structure and environment,
Right.
and the consequences for appropriate behavior versus inappropriate behavior. And we're likely going to have a lot of thoughts on that. But depending on your contract, your MOA, the goals that you have set forth, the reason you're in the building, you've really got to stick to that. Otherwise, the relationship can become dicey if there's this perception of evaluation, or this perception of, as a teacher, this person's here because there's a perception that I don't know how to do my job. You know what I mean? So it's really about balancing that and staying true to the reason you're there, doing your data, communicating effectively with administration, and really, it's a bit of a slippery slope when it comes to thinking about best practices and evidence-based practices and the things we would typically put in place to support a student. And if that's not happening in the classroom, how does that get reported back to the parent? So it really, what you don't want to do is sort of burn that bridge, because we know that that collaboration between home and school can be vital in supporting the student and developing generalization of skills across environments and that kind of thing. But without that partnership, it's not going to happen.
I think that's a good way to frame it. Is this, you want this to be a partnership. So whether you are a school division person or you are a private provider, going in with the mindset that we both want this student or this group of students to be successful, and we have different roles that we might play, but at the end of the day, we're going to partner to do that. And then all the skills that go along with that you talked about with communicating and collaboration and all of that. So I think these are all really good points. I think that they are great things to think about. Final thoughts from you?
Yeah, we know that these partnerships, private-public partnerships, are critical. And today we spent a lot of time talking about kind of that provider that might be supporting one student or providing direct services to one student. But we also know that divisions can contract out with companies who are BCBAs to work on more division-wide or classroom-wide kind of supports. And we've got a little over 1,400 behavior analysts in Virginia between the BCBAs, BCABAs, BCBADs, and we've got about 160 that work in public schools. And that includes TA providers. So we know we've got a lot. We've got a lot of behavior analysts that are even around in Northern Virginia and Tidewater, Central Virginia. But when we start looking at Southwest Virginia, we start looking at sort of the South Central region of the state, there are not providers there. And so we know that these public-private partnerships are going to be critical as behavior analysis builds in schools. And so as we promote the use of behavior analysts, it's just, we're really trying to recognize that we're trying to get more practitioners into schools because we know it can have a benefit for students, and employed by the school division because they embed easily into division-wide initiatives and can be leaders in the division to build capacity among teachers and administrators and really build good practice into school divisions. But it's also important to know that that private providers are out there, and when services are needed, we can help foster those strategies to build these relationships and partnerships so that kids are getting the services they need.
Well, I do appreciate that. And I think, you're right. There are only so many of us that work in public schools. And there's only so much of us to go around. And so having the option to bring in private providers and collaborate with them, I think can be a really beneficial experience for students as well as for providers in the school system. So I think looking at ways of doing that work for everyone is only going to help everyone. So Daniel, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about this topic. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And I hope that all our listeners will join us during our next episode.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Behavior Education Connection. Join us next time for another great conversation about behavior analysis in the schools. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on an episode. Sending out a special thanks to the Virginia Department of Education for supporting our work. We look forward to connecting with you all again soon.